Hello, I'm Dan Gibson,
I'm Chad Dole.
and we're talking about the Qibla Database, and I want to talk a little bit about what can be learned from the Qibla Database. What are some new things that we can look at and see, not just the Qiblas that face Petra and so forth, but are there other things that we can look at? And one of those we want to talk about is the development of mosques over time. As we have all these mosques now, we can see how different aspects of the mosques developed as the years went by.
Yeah, as I understand it, Dan, you've taken a special interest in some of the earliest mosques because the way they were constructed may not always fit the perception of or the beliefs that people have about what early Islam looked like.
Yeah, this is one of the challenges that I faced is many Muslims have this image that they've gotten that by the time Muhammad passed away, when he died, there must have been hundreds and hundreds of thousands of followers, and they get this because some of the numbers in the Battle of Mu'tah that are there, some of the other things that come along, and so they've got this idea of everything was so big, but even if there were some big numbers, you spread them out because people lived in all their different villages and towns. And so the first mosques that I discovered were not very large. They were actually very small. But there are some things that you recognize as I go from one mosque to another. And so I'll just pull out a few examples. The first one is Hayyan Mishref, which is in Jordan. And when I went to look at this mosque, it was very interesting because it's not very big. Got down inside of it, and there was a mihrab there, but you could see looked like it had been a doorway maybe that at one time that they had filled in or something was there, but it was. The mihrab had been added, and then it had been twisted a little.
Yeah, an adjustment had been made to the structure.
Right. So then, you're looking at this, but it was only about 20 feet wide. I think it measured 21 feet wide, 13 feet deep. So in every mosque, we see that there's a very wide wall, the Qibla wall, and that's the one you can measure the direction. And then the early mosques were not very deep. They weren't square. They were wide rectangles. And the reason for that is people would stand shoulder to shoulder in a row, and then they could do their prayers and bow down and stand up and go through all the actions. And if there were too many people for one row, they could add a second row. But most of these mosques only had room for 2 or at the most 3 rows of people standing in them. So the expectation wasn't that there are going to be a huge number of people there.
Right.
And so these are in towns. I had no idea how many people lived in the towns because they were so packed together, a lot of these towns, very dense. But the mosques all have that basically twice as wide as they're deep. And so that was Hayyan Mishref, showing the pictures there. Just explain, and you can see that there's no columns in between. It's just a room. Well, you go down the road, maybe a half hour or so, you come to the city of Suf. And in Suf, there's a very old mosque. What's interesting is the oldest mosque was built on the hill, bottom of the hill, and then later they added a new mosque. They went upstairs and built it into the hill behind. So one side you go into like the basement, and the other one you go above. So the one in the basement is an interesting mosque to look at. Again, it's about 20 feet wide and about 13 feet deep, almost the same size. It doesn't have columns in it. It doesn't need them because of the size. And they're just as you go in, you recognize this is the shape of the mosque that they were building back at that time. That mosque is dated as well, and so it goes back to the early Umayyad period, but that's when an inscription was put there. When was the mosque actually built? That is a challenge. We don't know because some of these were remodeled, inscriptions added. But so we can go back. It's an early Umayyad mosque, and we can see when it was built and the shape it was built.
So what you're finding is probably these weren't lavishly decorated, and they certainly weren't large and grand buildings, and the natural conclusion you've come to is they probably didn't serve a large Muslim population.
That's right. And they were very plain. As you said, there's no decorations on the walls. There's nothing, they were functioning. There was a functioning building. And I think many mosques at that time were also open air. They had just cleared a spot and people prayed outside. These are ones that actually had a roof put over them, so we can go back and look at those mosques. So that gives you an idea of very early mosques. As we go along in the database, another example of one that developed a little more is in the city of Jamal. Jamal was a trading city, a very fascinating city. It was walled like around the outside, but it had city on one end and city in the other, and in the middle is this huge empty place, because that's where the caravans came, and there were water cisterns there, and caravans would come in and then they would go. It was a city full of Byzantine churches, and so we can go, there's lots of churches you can visit. And I remember going to Jamal numerous times. It's on the road often where I would be traveling, and I would stop in and look and think, where are the mosques? And there's one mosque that was identifiable. It had been a church. It had been converted into a mosque. But the problem with Jamal is that when the archaeologists were there, they didn't recognize some of the buildings. So there is a big qasr that's there, an Islamic qasr, but they called it a castlearium or something, thinking back using Roman terms. And so so if you look at it as a qasr, you realize, okay, this is typical of an Islamic qasr being built in that time period. Big building, and it looks military because it's square and it's got, arrow slots around the outside, but all the rooms face an inner courtyard. And in that, it's really tumbled down, and it's hard to determine which room was the original mosque that was used for prayer. But they could always pray in that central courtyard. And as I measured that qasr, it faced Petra, as did all the other mosques of that early time period. But then on the side of this qasr, they had built a building, like a room, a big room that comes out, and the early archaeologists called it a chapel. Because you can recognize a church. A church has got asps, okay, and that's a proper church. This didn't have any asps. It doesn't have any decorations. It's got 2 rows of columns, or is it 3 rows? Just don't remember right off the bat, but they're square columns that were put up so that they could make this room a little bigger. What's fascinating is that it has a big flat wall on one side. And that's always what I'm looking at. Measure that wall. It is facing Petra. Exactly.
Exactly like the qasr next door then.
Right. Yeah. It's an extension of it. And as I looked at it, I realized, well, this is a mosque. You enter in the back, and the Qibla wall is in front of you. There is a square room in the side, which may have been a minaret base going up. And as I looked, I realized, okay, this is a mosque on the side of a qasr, but it has grown bigger. It's no longer it looks bigger, but it's 48 feet wide, but only 22 feet deep. And therefore, it is roughly twice as wide as it is deep. So those dimensions, they're not measuring exactly, but it's the overall shape of the building is still an early mosque as you look at it.
Now, as I understand it, the mihrab was adopted later in Islamic history. So some of these early mosques, you wouldn't expect to find them. So are they often missed for that reason, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I think the archaeologists, they're looking for a mihrab. Because when you find a mihrab, you go mosque.
Yeah, easy.
And when you find asp or 3 asp, you go church. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, it's easy. But when you get just a square room or a rectangular room, it's just a rectangular room. And the only way you can tell is to actually check the orientation of the room to see, does this actually fit? But there's other things. You've got to be able to come from the back of it and come in, and usually then the Qibla wall is in front of you. So they don't mess up the Qibla wall too much. You might be a door on the side or something, but it's obvious when you come in that's a Qibla wall. And so you've got to look for those kinds of things. just to recognize that it was a mosque. It's got the right shape, it's got the right date, it's got orientation, and gives you a clue of what you're looking at.
And in this case, especially when there's a qasr next door that has the same orientation, then you can be fairly confident that you have a Qibla wall.
That's right. So moving on, we can go just down the road a ways to the city of Mufraq. Today it's a very large place that's growing. But long ago, at the center of the city, there was structures that were built by the Fudain family, and they have this mosque that still survives. They've done some excavation and brought up, and they found the old Qibla wall, and they've stood it up, and it's very interesting to go. Again, roughly twice as wide as it is deep, and it demonstrates several things. As I stood and looked at that Qibla wall, I recognized several things. Number one, it's ornate. And so there's this whole idea of now decorating up. It's not just a functional building, it's an impressive building. And so it has a beautiful work of all kinds of architectural designs and squares and different things in it. And it's got some columns on the side of the mihrab. And as I looked at that, I recognized, wow, because all the earliest mosques had square columns or square decorations or whatever, or maybe if an arch came around, it's square coming up and going around. Here you have square pillars, but you've got right beside them a round pillar. They've put the round pillar in here. Now this is something you see in Roman or Byzantine or structures. You will see the round columns, but here is a round column in a mosque. And so now you can see new things are slowly being introduced that were not there in the previous mosque. So we can see this development much more ornate and still just developing. What is interesting is that from this mosque onward, we begin to see larger mosques being built as you have larger towns. This idea of a Friday mosque or of a congregational mosque is beginning to develop. So people would say, let's build a big mosque where everybody can come on Friday and pray together. And so these smaller ones that were popular during the Rashidun era or the early Umayyad period now give way to some large, big square mosques. But there's something interesting. When you walk in and look at those earliest mosques, they are square, but they're not fully roofed. There's only about half of it has a roof over it. And so you have the mihrab wall, you still have a couple rows of columns, and you've got that covered, but the back wall is left open, so it's much bigger, so now it looks square, and that's open so that more people can come in on the Friday and pack it up. But during the week, it just operates as a small mosque up at the front.
But this does tell you that the Muslim community was clearly growing at this time. They were more wealthy as they had the wealth to spend on decorating these mosques. And Islam was becoming much like people maybe imagine it was at the outset.
That's right.
Large community, lots of wealth.
Yeah, and that then carries on. And
right.
So we can look back. But I don't see that pattern in the very earliest years. That would be in the first 100 years of Islam.
Right.
Things it's still growing. It's still developing. Armies might have marched through and conquered, but they didn't leave behind a lot of Muslims. And so the mosques were small, and slowly the whole thing grew over time. So this whole idea of qasrs that were being built, you see at the beginning people were living in tents or whatever. Eventually, and I think the whole economics was driven by the armies that marched. A lot of loot was gotten, and people were sending it back. So young guys say, "Oh, I'm going to go join the army, and I'll go marching." And when we conquer a town, everybody went around after the battle and grabbed whatever they could. Now, what were they going to do with that? They needed to send that back home to their family. And so, family at home was getting money in as young men were off going, and say you're a tribe of say 50, 60 people, extended family, and you've got 8 or 10 guys out there fighting, and stuff is coming back. Money comes in. They began to build bigger and bigger houses, and these Qasrs began. This is, you see this whole development of the Qasr, this very large building, often square or rectangular, but very, very large. Some 2,000 square meters or more. I mean, some of these large ones with rooms around the outside, and a Qibla oriented in the Qibla direction. Generally, the whole building had a Qibla direction, and on one end there would be a room, again a narrow, wide room, and
just like these early mosques.
Like the early mosques, but they would have access to the central courtyard, because if you have visitors there, and now it's time for prayer, they need to be able to go in and pray with everybody without going through private rooms. And so, I mean, you can identify the mosque there by the Qibla wall. Again, check the orientation. Is it a Qibla wall? And it has access. And generally, you can just look at the floor plan of a Qasr and go, there's the mosque.
Now, is it fair to say that historians haven't traditionally recognized the Qibla orientation of the Qasr? Because you can clearly verify it by GPS, by satellite images. Have they done a lot of that work, or is this a little bit new?
This is all new. Everything that I'm saying here is new, because I'm looking at the data, and I can look at that, and I can see that really what it needs somebody with degrees in Islamic architecture to go back now and look at these buildings and develop out this progression. I'm just off the top of my head looking at it and going, I see a progression. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so there's a lot of study to be done. I'm not the guy who's going to do that. It needs people, specialists, to go in and to look at this. I wish Caswell was still around. He died back in the 70s, but he did that with the few mosques that he had available to him. Now we have many, many more mosques. And so now they can flesh that out and see how the mosque developed.
So then it's fair to say that with Let the Stone Speak, what you've compiled isn't so much a history of the mosque development as it is the Qibla development. Because these large buildings also adopted Qiblas, which are as valid as any other prayer direction in a mosque.
That's right. So that's, again, there's a lot of study that needs to be done. But I'm excited. I mean, because this opens a whole new area, and other people are going to go in and do this. I'm going to retire and sit back and watch them do it and come up with their own conclusions, and that's how it works. I look at it and see something. Now they're going to come along and see something else, and and they'll publish papers, and I think hopefully it'll just take off.
But with your Qibla database and the Qibla tool, the groundwork is there. There's lots of room for other scholars to take this up and do their work.
That's for sure. And I'm trusting that more and more archaeologists will learn to recognize these places of prayer, and we can. I'm sure there's more out there, and we can add to that database and see this whole thing grow.
Perfect.
And thank you for joining us. We've enjoyed talking together about the development of mosques in the very first years of Islam.